As I called out in the last video, before embarking on bringing the bike back to standard, I had already carried out a lot of work overhauling much of the bike before starting down the cafe racer path. So in this video I'll step back in time a bit, actually about 6 years, and cover off the engine rebuild. But before I dive into the detail, I will call out that this is a hobby for me and that I am not a motorcycle mechanic. As a result, I'm pretty sure that there are things I have done or will do that will not necessarily be correct, so please do bear that in mind. Do, however, feel free to leave comments. I will read them and if possible respond. One final point is that I don't have a lot of video from when I first worked on the bike, but I do have many pictures, so this video will consist mainly of the latter. With the engine out of the frame, or more accurately, the frame removed from the engine, we can see that it was clearly showing its 32 years of life. First job was to remove the gearbox from the rear and put that to one side. We'll come back to that later. Next I pulled off the rocker covers and removed the rocker gear from both heads. Then the push rods before removing the heads, barrels and using a makeshift tool, the pistons. As can be seen, I've not yet removed the valves. After removing the alternator windings, getting the rotor off the front end of the crank was a tough job. Although it's held in position with a bolt, it's actually a taper on the crankshaft that's holding it, and after 32 years it was holding it bloody tight. To remove it, a bolt is screwed into the rotor after a piece of mild steel bar is inserted, and the bolt acts on the bar which is bottomed out in the crank. From memory it took me a couple of days to get this off, with me resorting to all sorts of tricks to encourage it, including wrapping the rotor in a hot towel to try to get it to expand. With the alternator out of the way, I can take off the timing cover to access and remove the cam chain. The nut on the crank here requires a specific Moto Guzzi tool and an impact wrench to remove. The cam can now be removed. I then remove the oil pump, which is situated just below the crank. To remove the flywheel and clutch assembly, I use a piece of brass through one of the small ends and some wood to lock the crank in position. This allows me to strip and remove the clutch and then remove the flywheel. I now move on to the bottom end and flip the engine over to expose the sump. The retaining bolts are removed and the sump taken off. This exposes the crank and the conrod retaining bolts, which I remove along with the conrods and the big end bearings. The space inside this crankcase is cavernous. I mentioned in the last video the breathers that feed up into the top frame tube. These can be seen here inside the bell housing before I remove them. To remove the crank, I first remove the rear bearing plate, and with a bit of help from a soft mallet to the front of the crank, it's extracted out through the rear. This allows me to then remove the front bearing plate. I'm almost done now in terms of the engine strip. All that remains is to use a valve spring compressor and remove the valves from the heads. Prior to popping them out, I did note that the valves were very sloppy in their guides, which I'll come back to later. A quick note on small parts. As I was pulling the engine apart, I was quite meticulous in bagging and labelling everything. Before taking the relevant parts for vapour blasting, I gave them all a thorough cleaning with degreaser and a good rinse with a pressure washer. From the engine, the parts I had blasted were the crankcase, sump extender, which I don't believe was a standard part, front cover, barrels and the heads. I've included some before and after pictures so you can see how well the vapour blasting worked. In the greatest tradition of a Haynes manual, rebuilding the engine really was a case of reversing the order taken for disassembly. Of course, all parts were thoroughly cleaned beforehand, and all gaskets and oil seals were replaced with new items. I used assembly grease on all bearing surfaces, which stands out in the pictures because it's red, and tightened all nuts and bolts to the specified torque. Regarding fasteners, it would appear that a previous owner had swapped out some of the external bolts for stainless items, but I replaced those again and also swapped out most of the other external nuts and bolts for stainless. There are arguments both ways for this approach. Of course, originality is lost, but I'm not aiming for nut and bolt restoration, and even if I was, I'm too late. Another key argument against using stainless is a dielectric issue, with aluminium and stainless steel being particularly reactive when combined with water, leading to corrosion. In my case, this is countered by the use of anti-seize compound and, of course, ultimately keeping the bike out of the wet. Regarding internal fasteners, I mainly reuse original items but replace any that were showing damage. Luckily, there is good market for new spares for Guzzis. I did make a couple of significant modifications to the engine. First was to bin the cam chain and fit a gear drive, although looking at my pictures it would appear that I did first refit the chain. The gear drive should avoid cam chain wear issues going forwards, but I have read in some places that it may bring its own challenges. The other modification was to fit a lightened flywheel. This should give me a little bit more acceleration, but I have read that it can also lead to hunting. Time will tell for both of these mods. Clutch reassembly does require a special tool or the spline boss from the gearbox input shaft. I was able to use the latter as I had also stripped the gearbox down at this time, and I'll cover that off in a separate video. Because the cylinder bores are chrome lined, overboring is not an option, otherwise I might have been tempted to try and squeeze a bit more power from the engine. It is possible to buy a big bore kit with new barrels and pistons which will take it out to 949cc. That's maybe a mod for later. I did mention earlier the sloppy fit of the valves in the guides. I was not happy to refit the heads in this state, so I dropped them off at an old school engineering shop in Slough and had new valve stem guides fitted and machined. Sadly, that shop closed last October. I reground the valves back into their respective seats, for which I do have some video, albeit without sound. I'm pretty sure that I replaced the valve springs with new items, but without checking my scrap parts bin, I'm not 100% certain. However, when refitting the valves I did reshim them. To finish off this video, the last job was to spend a bit of time with some wet and dry and the buffing wheels to polish the rocker covers. Obviously this has been a quick run through with lots of detail missing, such as the oil feed lines to the heads and the distributor, but it should give a view as to what I did to bring the engine back up to standard and looking good, although it is now looking in need of a good clean. If you liked the video, please do give me a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe. Thanks for watching.